Good afternoon, little brother.
Good afternoon, big brother.
We are the Steinmetz brothers, and this is our podcast, the Pseudo Scholars Podcast, where we believe that science isn't just for scientists. We think that science is for anyone with integrity who honestly wants to know more about the world, and that's us. So each week, we grapple with reality by challenging what we think we know about stuff.
Yeah, on this podcast, there's no topic that we're not going to examine. We ask questions about what's new in the cryptocurrency world, or what's the oil market going to look like in 30 or 40 years, and then how did Trump really ultimately win the White House, right? We want to examine all of these big issues. We want to ask the hard questions, examine the research, and then form our own opinions, and hopefully leave everyone really informed, stimulated, and inspired.
All right, Cade. So imagine a world that is controlled, that's dominated by a few million rich people. They control all the industry, they control the entire labor market, and everyone else. So we're talking about a future in which robots and machines have completely taken over the labor market. And I think that a lot of the research and studies are showing that this is already starting to happen. Automation technology is killing jobs left and right. We'll get into examples. Normal jobs, as we've known them, are paying much less. And I think a big question we have to answer is, any job safe? Is yours safe? Is mine safe?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to think about. And one thing that I think we always like to challenge ourselves as we go and ask these kinds of questions, Shane, is trying to think about our day-to-day lives and think about the companies that we work in, the environments that we're employed by, and really ask ourselves the tough question today, which is, what is that going to look like in 30 or 40 years?
Well, let's put some things into perspective and compare a company from the past with a company from the present, which I think paints this picture very nicely. In 1964, AT&T was the most valuable company in the United States and essentially in the entire world. They were worth a little bit less than $300 billion, and they employed about 760,000 people. Okay, so less than $300 billion in today's dollars, accounting for inflation, and they employed 760,000 people. Let's compare them with a company that's doing a similar thing today, but in the technology era, the era of the internet, and we're talking about Google. So Google is worth about $650 billion, twice as much as AT&T was worth, accounting for inflation still, but they only employ 72,000 employees. So they employ a tenth of what AT&T was employing in 1964 when AT&T was the most powerful company in the world. I think this shows a very obvious trend. Technology is replacing people, and we need to start planning for a future without jobs. We're entering into this era of a technological unemployment situation.
Right. So what we want to really examine in depth today are, number one, you just laid it out for us. What is technology's impact going to be on the labor market? What has it been historically, and how's that going to change over time? What are the patterns? What are the trends? And then we want to talk about one of the proposed theoretical solutions to that, which is UBI, or universal based income.
Okay, so let's start with talking about technology and the labor market today and get people caught up to speed with what's actually happening with the labor market. I think it helps to start with asking the question, well, how is technology killing jobs, if it is? So it really all comes down to Moore's law. Gordon Moore was a computer scientist and electrical engineer back at Intel, way back in the days when the semiconductor foundations laid the groundwork for what is now the modern day Silicon Valley and technology scene. We're talking about computing. And he said that computing power is multiplying, but the cost of computing is declining. He made that observation. And that is still true today. So computing power is continuing to get more and more powerful. Every time you buy an iPhone or you buy your new MacBook, it's more powerful than the last iteration. But the cost of that computing technology is going down. So that's a very, very powerful phenomenon. And ultimately, it's responsible for this new era of technology that we're seeing. That trend is. I mean, we're seeing a trend in which AI, artificial intelligence, and robotics are basically capital substitute for labor. And that's an important concept to grasp and get our heads wrapped around. So I'm going to say it one more time. Artificial intelligence, robotics, and technology in general is becoming a capital substitute for labor. The yield is much higher when you talk about productivity. You think about increased efficiencies, safety, convenience in general. All of those factors are much better when you're talking about technology in comparison with human labor. So naturally, we've been seeing a big boom in economic growth that's spurned from technology and less so from the labor market.
Right. So machines and software are essentially going to be able to replace the everyday tasks that lots and lots of people are performing today. And obviously that's cheaper for companies, and that's why they're driving towards that kind of technological advancement. It's because the laws of economics are on their side. But one thing people ought to think about when they think about Moore's law is just economies of scale, right? We're seeing exponential growth in the technology department because as it's improving, it's also getting cheaper, and it's improving at exponential rates, which is kind of makes it this greenhouse effect, essentially, to see this massive technological advancement that we've seen over the last 50 years and that we expect to, continue long into the future, right? But yeah, Shane, I mean, I guess the short and skinny of it is that, automation technology is cheap, right? And so companies are wanting to optimize. And one way that you optimize is to get rid of people on the bottom line, which is all of your cost employees. In any business, salaries and benefits are going to be your biggest cost. So if I can replace that with software and with machines, then obviously that's something I want to do as a business owner, and the market's going to demand. And so McKinsey, right, which is kind of the world famous consulting company, they did a study. And they basically found that 60% of all occupations have at least 30% of the activities associated with those occupations are automatable. Essentially, they can be improved by technology and replaced. So that's a massive number, and it's something that we're seeing happening with companies like Amazon, right? The big platform internet sales company. You think about some of the jobs they're replacing. They're replacing cashiers, right? We don't need people to check out and price our goods and services anymore. They've got all this online platform shopping that doesn't require people to execute the tasks just to support it. So it diminishes the labor market in that space. And then you also think about companies like Tesla, right, who are really working on the self-driving vehicles and obviously driverless trucks, 18-wheeler transportation logistics. That's 3.5 million jobs, Shane. I mean, it's absolutely incredible and staggering what technology is going to take a bite out of in the near future.
It absolutely is. And I know we talked about Amazon and Tesla in those two examples, but McKinsey's study encompassed all major industries in the United States. So, and finding that 60% of occupations have at least 30% of positions that could be fully automated at this point says something about the fact that where our technology is today, but think about where it's going into the future. And we've talked about exponential growth. Like, that's an important concept to get our heads wrapped around, because where we are today, we're already in a world where companies are considering automation. I mean, do you have any examples of that from your company? Because I know that in my world, in the startup scene, and even in my prior world in Silicon Valley, we're constantly looking at opportunities for automation through software primarily. That seems to be the most powerful source of automation that people are dealing with on a daily basis. But I would just say that, like, no industries are safe. Everyone is talking about optimizing and automating, which is really just code for trade employees because they're expensive, get rid of them and trade them for software.
Oh yeah, and they're complicated to manage, right? People are all, I mean, they're your biggest asset right now because they're the majority of the market is not capital, it's labor, but they're also your biggest problems. And so you think about all of the things that you have to do to maintain the right environment. You have legal statutes and limitations about how you treat your employees. All this kind of stuff is going to make it economically more incentivized to drive towards this type of automation. But to answer your question, Shane, the answer is absolutely. There's tons and tons of jobs. In fact, I think you're right. There are very few jobs that we have at our company that can't be done by a machine or won't be able to be done by a machine in the next 20 or 25 years. And that's what a lot of the research is telling us. And so when I think about some of the number one jobs in my company that could be replaced, it's accounting, it's finance, it's support roles that are basically just taking data and analyzing it. And I think most people here know today that computers are much better at analyzing data than, say, we are. And so really you look and you say, hey, maybe in 10 years I don't need 30 accountants adding up the revenue on these 15 assets. I really only need 1 or 2 to manage it. And that's the kind of impact that we're talking about.
Okay, so there's some computer scientists listening who are saying, well, what about us? Because we're going to be needed to program the machines and tell the machines how to communicate. And there is definitely a sense of truth to that. I've heard it described, at least in one of the Atlantic articles that Cade and I read in advance of this session. You could think of it like a bell curve, basically. And on one side of the bell curve would be labor, real intensive labor, hard blue collar work, maybe a factory worker. In the middle of the bell curve, the biggest portion of the bell curve, we're dealing with middle class jobs. And maybe that's a kind of job like Cade's working right now, or that I was working in Silicon Valley when, we're crunching data, we're working with projects, and we're looking at analytics and trying to make ways to improve processes and stuff like that within the company. All those services jobs probably all go in there. These are the undergraduate degrees where people are going and working for big companies. And then on the other end of the bell curve, the A+ side of the bell curve, we've got the highly skilled, highly technical jobs. And what we're probably going to start seeing is a massive push for there to be higher and higher demand for jobs in that side of the bell curve. But then this side of the bell curve is going to become completely obsolete. So today we're really mostly talking about labor. We're not talking about plasma physicists and computer scientists losing their jobs right away. We want to focus on labor today.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because the key to understanding this is to understand what's the labor market look like in the United States. And the fact of the matter is the majority of people working jobs and collecting income from those jobs are not computer scientists, right? They're the everyday, driving trucks and transporting oil in Houston, or they're, checking you out at the Kroger, or, you think about the number of jobs that this looks like, and you're really impacting a lot of people. So again, this is a kind of a pseudo scholar principle to think beyond just how does this affect myself, but what's going to be the impact to the economy in the United States and then ultimately to the world.
Yeah, and you named the two jobs that Americans do more of than any other job. Truck driving is by far the number one job for American males, and I want to say cashiers might be the number one job all inclusively if you include both genders. And Amazon is totally destroying cashiers. I mean, when you think about that deal that just got done with Whole Foods, I heard an analyst say they basically just fired off 1 million cashiers in the United States the day that happened. They don't know they've lost their jobs, but they're going to lose their jobs. And truck drivers are losing them because of automated driving technology that we talked about in some of our earlier podcasts.
Right. No, and I want to go back really quickly, Shane, before we move forward and rehash through Moore's Law, because everyone's going to ask the question, well, why would I automate driving trucks? Well, because it's my biggest cost if I'm a logistics company, right? So I've got incentives to do that. So you think, well, what about all the little jobs like digging, fitting two pieces of pipe together? You say, well, it's not really expensive. Why would a company do this? But the problem is the trend in Moore's Law is that computing is going to get more advanced. Robotics are going to get more technologically proficient, and they're going to get cheaper. So all of a sudden, those narrow margin jobs are going to become beneficial for the employers to then go in and replace them with this new technology. So it's really kind of don't take a short-term approach to this thing, I guess is what I'm saying, is that really nothing is safe if technology continues to advance at the rate that it is.
Yeah, and when you think about the fact that computers used to take up entire rooms to do simple calculator functions, now we've got microchips that get embedded in packages for tracking. I mean, those are legitimate microchips. So Moore's Law has absolutely taken effect. And why wouldn't an organization who's looking after its best interest, its profits, like all companies are, like all businesses are, why would they not exchange an employee for a microchip when an employee requires health care and needs dental care and sometimes doesn't show up on time because they have problems at home and all these other challenges that are easily resolved with a technology if the technology can do the same job?
Yeah, so this all comes down to one question, Shane, or we have to really lay the foundation. Help us understand the average Joe that doesn't really think about the labor market outside of their own, industry or their own role in their own industry. What does the labor market look like today in the United States? What are these impacting?
Yeah, the numbers show that it is slowly starting to die. And one of the ways that we are seeing indications of this is through their organizations, the way that labor has always organized itself. I don't want to get too political here, but I think it's comfortable. I think I can comfortably say, having looked at the data, that unions are not particularly effective anymore inside of the United States. Unions can't stop technology. They can do their best to hold fast and recognize and look out for the best interests of blue collar, hardworking men and women. But what unions can't do is they can't stop technology. And so this is not really an issue about mistreatment of workers. Workers historically, at least since the agricultural revolution, have done a really good job of banding together and finding solutions to problems and combating big government and big business that might not always have their best interests at heart. When they associate together, they are a powerful organization. But I would just reinforce that they can organize themselves all they want, but there's nothing that you can do to prevent an employer from saying, I don't need you anymore because I have a technology. Unions can't stop that growth of technology. And the best example of this is probably the coal mines. We don't need coal mines much anymore. And naturally, there are no more major coal mining unions that have any real influence in the United States. That's just one simple example.
Right. So there are obviously these places that we're seeing labor dying, but then you got to also ask the question, like you said, obviously, because we're spurning off new technology, that's going to create some jobs, right? And I guess it's all about the growth rates, which one is expanding at a faster rate. But are there any parts of the labor market that are growing, that aren't showing these signs of kind of decay?
Yeah, there are. And these aren't labor as we would typically think about them, but they're things that we interact with and technologies that we're using on a daily basis that we don't necessarily think about as labor, but may represent at least a bridge between now and when we achieve some kind of artificial intelligence or some extreme robotics improvements where robots and technology can do all of the work. Where there is some growth in this market, like the labor market, is particularly in digitally enabled independent work. So we're talking about people who can do their jobs from their homes on their computers. There's still some growth in that area. It seems that right now about 20% of the US and European Union labor market under the age of 35 are starting to do this type of work now. They're doing independent digital work. Whether they're entrepreneurs, I'd argue there's a very small percentage of them that are actually entrepreneurs. Most of them are just freelance and they're outsourcing their skills through a digital independent solution. And usually this is beneficial for companies because companies don't have to pay for benefits. That's a big plus. They can hire a remote worker in the Philippines to crunch some data for them. It's low cost, and there are very, very few requirements in terms of having to support that individual, as opposed to a full-time employee at a Fortune 500 publicly traded company like Euroscade, where the government says X, Y, and Z about how they have to treat you.
Sure. And the on-demand growth that's increasing is actually pretty cool. I've actually got a buddy right now who just moved to part-time at his, more standard 40-hour-a-week job, but he's got some skills in kind of web design and video editing and things like that. And so he uses an application. I'm not sure if it's called Tackle. There's a lot of them out there now, but it's amazing what technology's done to unlock the potential energy that's stored up in these small tasks that are really more efficiently consumed than agreeing to go work for a company for 40 hours a week for 10 years. Am I going to have 40 hours a week for you? Is that efficient for you or for me? And we'll ask those questions towards the end. But I guess the short and skinny of it, Shane, is that the American dream that we hear everyone talking about on both the right and the left of the political aisles, it's dying. And 50% of Americans, when polled now, don't really believe in it anymore. I'm not sure that I've ever really bought into it as a millennial of what this American dream is. But college degrees are just not going as far as they did for our parents. And we have more degrees than we know what to do with in our society right now. And middle class income is stagnant for the first time since the 70s. And so that's what everyone's been talking about, right? In the political arena is we've got this shrinking middle class and we're becoming more and more lopsided. And so obviously the political agenda is who's causing that? How do we change the policies? But we also have to look at how technology is really changing things. And then how do we adjust our policies in order to make them conducive for the best outcome for the most people?
Right. I think hopefully we've proven, or at least shown in some areas, that technological change is accelerating. I mean, that's a no-brainer. People recognize it. But also that process of accelerating technology is going to continue to displace workers and terminate careers. So what do we do next? I mean, here's a really scary statistic from Oxford University, a reputable source if I know any. They've forecasted that machines could or should start to perform 50% of all American jobs in the next 20 years. So when we ask the question at the beginning, is your job safe? Is my job safe? I think a lot of people would have to take a really serious look in the mirror at this point when we're saying that 50% of all American jobs could be done by machines or computers in the next 2 decades. it's a scary thought. And I think we absolutely have to be considering some solutions and preparation for what happens when technology takes over.
Right. The time for self-examination is here. Self-honesty, it's a little bit uncomfortable. It's a little bit scary, but now is the time to start thinking about how these problems are going to be solved. Because if the technology really is growing exponentially, then these problems are going to be on top of us long before we thought that all of the computers, or the sci-fi films and things like that that projected these kinds of things have predicted. So one thing we should really talk about, Shane, is what this proposed solution is, or at least one proposed solution, which is the universal basic income. So we're going to flesh this out a little bit, but first I want to talk about why labor market disruption is bad, where we've seen technology come in and gobble up jobs in the past, and what have been some of the results, right? So a good example of this is Youngstown, Ohio, which used to be a booming manufacturing place for steel mills in pre-World War II. It was the model city for American prosperity, right? When you think about the golden age of American capitalism, you think about a place like Youngstown, Ohio, where I definitely didn't need to have an incredible amount of education in order to get a really, really good paying job that, manufacturing a product that was widely demanded. And so post World War II, 50,000 jobs were lost when manufacturing was shifted abroad. And so the post World War II mechanism really caused what economists refer to as a regional depression, where it was felt so deeply in just this one targeted area because they were so heavy into this one industry. And the effects, Shane, have really been devastating. And we're seeing it, far beyond just economic factors like, are they making less money? Are more people unemployed? We're talking about really personal factors like depression levels or spousal abuse or suicide ratings or how many alcoholics there are per capita. I mean, it was really staggering. And, some of the results are just a little bit scary to think about. Tons of prisons being built in that area, at least four for that population, which was massive because everyone is more susceptible to crime because they're not making income. Maybe they have to steal food, or maybe it's just the result of the existential threat of not working anymore. And then since 2000, right, 30% of all manufacturing jobs in the world have been eliminated. So this is not something that's just targeted within that region anymore, Shane. This is happening globally. This is changing our world.
Yeah, Youngstown, Ohio is just an example. And it's probably a really good example when we think about the current political climate and the election of Donald Trump, which we talk about so regularly here because it is such an interesting phenomenon. I think there are a lot of correlations to these political and socioeconomic changes that are going on in the central parts of the United States that at some point in their history have been booming towns. People in Youngstown, Ohio, I have no idea if they voted for Donald Trump, but I'm going to just guess that they did because they probably remember, or their grandparents remember, what it was like to be an era of prosperity. And now they're in a period where nobody even knows where it is. It's a place that's hardly even on the map anymore. So we have a legitimate concern as to how we're going to deal with this, because we can't all just live in San Francisco and New York and be computer scientists and plasma physicists creating the next great technologies. What is going to happen to the average Joe, the average person who's living in Youngstown, Ohio? This is the best argument that I've ever heard for the universal basic income. So it's going to sound socialist coming out of my mouth right out of the gate, but I am anything but. So let's see this thing through. Let's talk about it. So the universal basic income, what is it? It's an unconditional grant given to every citizen, regardless of their employment status or wealth. So it's a check from the government on a regular and recurring basis to every single citizen, regardless of their employment status or wealth. So whether they're a San Francisco person or they're a Youngstown, Ohio person, they're collecting a check from the government every single month that would presumably meet the minimum requirements for them to, at least provide shelter for their families, food, clothing, and all the bare necessities for, living a reasonably good middle-class life in the United States. So I think a question we have to ask, Cade, is this a rejection of conservative values and an adoption of socialist principles? Because those of us in the United States are weary of principles outside of conservative values because we know what we think has worked for us for a really long time. And so the idea of something like this, a free handout, is pretty nerve-wracking, right?
Yeah, but I don't necessarily see it on either side of the aisle being, supported openly and in a widespread fashion, at least early on, because at the end of the day, our democratic setup still has certain people representing certain people in regions like Ohio or Kentucky, where you've seen, who cares if coal is dying? If my community, my constituency all want to work in coal and they've worked in coal their whole life, then I'm going to fight to bring back the coal industry. So this is really kind of cutting edge political thought here. And that's why I wouldn't necessarily have expected Milton Friedman to throw himself into the ring in support of this. But it's really, we're having to regulate and legislate in a way that we've never had to think about before, because technology just didn't have the role that it's had, in recent years.
Yeah. Well, do you remember the Nobel Prize winner? You know anything about his work?
Yeah, so he's a University of Chicago economist. He won a Nobel Prize, I think 60s or 70s, but he's really famous for a book that he wrote called Free to Choose. And one of the things that he does in that book is he holds up a pencil and he looks at this pencil and he says, this pencil has an eraser, it's got wood, it's got lead, graphite in the middle of it, and it's got this little metal clasp that holds the eraser in. And then he says, no one in the world can do this. This is why we need a globalized economy, because every single you're going to get wood from the rainforest in the Amazon, then you're going to get the metal from a steel mill in Youngstown, Ohio. But the problem is that, his free to choose only exists in a world where you're manufacturing at the way that, at the rate that our world has manufactured at. And so I don't think he really understood, at least at that time, what technology was going to do. But as kind of a political neutral guy who tended to have more conservative values, it's really amazing that he would identify with this kind of alignment politically of, universal basic income.
Yeah, that's right. And before he died, he was a proponent of some solution like a universal basic income. Another great proponent of this on the conservative side, one of my favorite current thinkers, kind of philosophers and political activists, you might call him, is Charles Murray in the United Kingdom. Give him a Google. He's also a proponent of the UBI, despite being quite a conservative thinker in most of his practices in terms of policy, et cetera. So you're finding people on both sides of the aisles that are interested in this UBI, and there's people on both sides of the aisles that are not interested in it. But what Friedman said about a UBI is what's of most interest to me. He basically said that the current welfare system that we have today is never going to work because it eliminates people's liberty. People are given more freedom and more opportunity when they have a UBI system in place, when they have a bottom line check that's coming in every single day. And hopefully that could be something that would stimulate growth and lead us out of a cycle of poverty that welfare has kind of brought us into. So we're talking about a world in which the government gives cash instead of managing welfare. So it gives you cash to make decisions with that money as to what best you want to do with it. So you can go and you can buy a bag of Cheetos with it, and you can buy a Subway sandwich, or you could go and buy sushi. I don't know, like some healthy alternative. Like the idea here is that people have the abilities to choose for themselves what to do with their bare minimum, as opposed to what the welfare system is today, which is usually like food stamps. So people can only use their food stamps at certain institutions, and those institutions don't usually have healthy food, as an example. So there's a lot less options. There's a lot more restriction on where people can live when they have Section 8 government housing, when they're in the welfare system. Whereas if you give somebody a check for $30,000 for the year, or in increments, I don't know how exactly it works, and I don't know what the number is, but then people have the liberties to do with it what they want.
Sure. And this is where we really have to appreciate the kind of cutting edge thinking that Milton Friedman did. Take off your political hat when thinking about this, right? Because no side of politics aligns directly with one side or the other. And no one could have predicted this kind of technological advancement, or at least envisioned practically what it was going to look like. So you have to really appreciate what Milton Friedman can do as kind of a political scientist, so to speak, and really be objective and say, how do we get to the best outcome for the most people? So even though people know him as a conservative economist, hopefully he was only conservative because he really believed the data pointed to that leading to the best outcome for the most people. And so remember now that this universal basic income that may seem like a liberal idea actually is really just a scientific or economic idea that is designed to benefit the most people in the most effective way.
Exactly. And there's one other downside to welfare when we're talking about a much larger percentage of people needing support. So in the welfare world, I don't know what it is, if it's 15% or 20% of the United States is on some kind of bare minimum welfare support. I don't know what it is, but it's not overly high to the sense that we're talking about. We're talking about a world in which it could be upwards of 70, 80% of people that can't make what they would need to live a good quality middle-class life because of the evolution of technology. You know, we're talking about a total disruption in the way that money is owned at the top and not filtered down to the bottom because we don't have a labor market anymore. So could the welfare system today just be scaled? You know, I'd argue that it's probably not a good idea. There'd be better solutions in place to give people liberties by giving them a check. That's part of the power behind the universal basic income. It's kind of like a replacement for welfare more than it is of welfare.
Right. And it's really a replacement for income because I no longer have access to go and make that income, right? We got to kind of get back to our foundation, which is saying that all of the capital, and we're saying that capital is moving from labor capital into technological capital, is really owned by far less people and organizations. And so all of these plethora of industries that are no longer going to need these jobs, we've really got to think about what's going to be the best income or the best result for the most people. And the idea, right, is distributing this. But I guess I have a hard time really trying to put this in some real perspective here, Shane. How many jobs do we think are going to be lost to technology in the next 10 years? Do we have predictions out there? Is there kind of a mechanism for thinking?
I mean, I referenced that Oxford study. That's one of the foremost studies that I've seen. And that was 50% in the next 2 decades, 50% of jobs in the next 2 decades. So it touches nearly everyone in their industries.
Right. So half of 50% is 25%, but assuming that it's exponential, slightly less than a quarter of the jobs in the next decade could be gone. And you ask yourself, well, maybe we haven't seen that yet, but we really see these spurts. I mean, historically, Shane, when we look at this technological advancement, we see no disruption. Then all of a sudden it's here and it's changing the world in a matter of weeks and months and short few years. And I would think, to the driverless car, things like that are really going to change things overnight. So we got to be prepared.
Right. So we got to be prepared. The UBI is one solution that we've been talking about, and we will talk about it just a little bit more. But I think one of the things that has to change in people's minds is, what is work? What value do we get from work? What is the purpose of work? Why is it something that we associate with our own identities? You know, if you're in a group of travelers, in my case, what is the very first thing you say with a person or exchange with another person from another country? Oh, what do you do? I.e., what is your work? How do you earn money? And that's how people tend to identify themselves. So I think that we probably need to enter into a period where we redefine what work looks like if we're going to move into an era where we have no more labor market. So I know that this could be controversial, but I think people can generally agree that our country was founded on Protestant principles, Judeo-Christian principles. And one of those major principles that's littered throughout the New Testament and throughout other Christian work and throughout the entire kind of new civilizations that were built out in Western Europe and that eventually spanned over here, was this idea of a hard work ethic. I think about the book of The Pilgrim's Progress. But what happens when we no longer have the ability to earn money, and what changes in the way that we think about work?
Sure. I guess you have to also ask the question, Shane, is this existential? Right? Do we need work as human beings to feel purposeful, to feel useful? I think there's some data that supports that people that don't work are not very happy, aka old people or retired, really, really wealthy people. You say, why are you coming back to work? You already have your money. Okay, it must be about more than just money. So we have to ask, is it existential or has it been learned? Because as you said, religious systems and especially New Testament Christianity has really affected the way that people see this. And, it's even interesting to know that different religions view work differently. Some it's as a necessary evil. Some it's a part of what human beings are supposed to do to redeem the earth. So,
and it's a good thing, right? Generally speaking, like Christianity would tell us, and our country was founded on very similar principles, that work is a good thing. Work ethic is important.
Yeah, work is good, and the result of work is good, right? You just harken back to Genesis. God, in the beginning, God creates the heavens, the earth. He looks at the heavens and the earth, and he says it's good. And he says it after all of his miracles when he's creating the world. And so, obviously, you see that if that's where we rose up from as a civilization, then that kind of thinking is going to be ingrained into the way that we see this. So it's kind of hard to parcel it all out,
Right. So that's a question that we need to be thinking about. What would happen to people if they weren't able to work for money? Well, there are examples of work that we do on a daily basis that aren't recognized with financial incentives. I mean, think about the work that's required in order to raise a family, something that's historically been done by women, but valued by all. And it's an unpaid role in society, but arguably the most important role in society. I think you could make a really strong argument there that there's nothing more important than raising our next generation. So that's a type of work in which there are no financial incentives necessarily, but it's something that's critically important to our society. Maybe we would contribute more time and effort into roles around the home, around raising and rearing families. But there's also loads of other examples of work that we do on a regular basis that are genuinely very, very fulfilling that aren't associated with paid work. So we think about tutoring and teaching people for free. At the Boys and Girls Club, where I volunteered regularly, volunteer work is also incredibly rewarding, as is coaching young soccer teams and young baseball teams. So there are examples in the way in which society can interact without having to have financial incentive potentially.
Yeah, I would encourage people, because when I first look at this topic, being a Christian, I kind of see, they want to remove work from us. That's not going to work. People need work. But I think it's the connection of work and money that is really hangs people up on this issue. Because what you're saying is work, right? And if we go back to other types of economies, like before we entered the Industrial Revolution, when everyone goes to a place to work, where did you work? You farmed at home with your parents, with your kids. You lived in these tight-knit communities, and we saw some really, high levels of happiness and also really effective societies that were kind of the platform for building us up. So I actually got to confess that I get really frustrated when I listen to the political arena always talking about money as if money is going to unlock the key to happiness for everyone. And the key to every kind of political action is to this American dream, increasing the quality of living. But then I think, is quality of living really about how much money you make, or is it about how fulfilling it is to spend your time? And so if I was unhinged from my current job and I didn't have to go there for money anymore, I don't think I would sit on my butt and play video games. I think I would go do the work that I think really, really matters. And just because I'm not exchanging that for income today, it doesn't allow me to do it. So what could be unlocked by this universal basic income is really people moving towards what they want to do, what they feel passionate about. And then you ask the question, when those two intersect, we really have effective transformation inside of society. So maybe that's not a bad thing.
Right. But what is the incentive? That would be a question that we have to ask. That's been the role of money, at least in my life, as a motivational tool, an incentive to take on new projects and new challenges, because I know that I'll earn the money that I need to support a family or whatever it is, support the lifestyle that I want. So how do we motivate and inspire people that don't have a requirement associated with earning money on a regular basis because they're being given enough money to survive? That's a hard question to deal with.
It's really challenging. Perhaps, Shane, some people are listening to this and they say a universal basic income, and if everyone's just being distributed money from the government, X number of dollars, and then I can do what I want. Number one, seems like there's a practical problem with immigration, right? Will everyone want to come and get a little slice of the pie? But then what are people going to do with their time? And the only way that an economy like that continues to thrive, where most of the output in GDP is created by the actual, technology, is what are people going to do with their time? How are people motivated? And if we do see data that says when people stop working, they tend to get a little bit miserable, I would also think that when people spend their lives on themselves, we tend to just not be as happy when we're really, truly, ultimately self-centered. So if I could take this distributed cash and then go spend my time impacting other people, building relationships, doing things that really matter to me, would that lead to greater levels of happiness? And I think there's probably a pretty good argument for it. So we're really not talking about work or no work. We're talking about what type of work and redefining what we think as being work.
Yeah, some technologists who've been studying this and thinking about this for a long time now refer to the singularity, or the period of time where a technological breakthrough means that very few people are actually working for income. Some people call that the end of human drudgery. Like a lot of us don't like our jobs. A lot of us aren't excited to wake up and go work in the cubicle every day, or drive our truck, or do whatever it is that we're doing. So it would be interesting to give people back their time and the necessary funds to live the life that they would need to live. And say, now what? It's going to be an interesting question and an interesting challenge that I think we probably will have to deal with in our lifetime. But we're talking about uncharted waters here. So it's good that we're breaking out this conversation and starting to have it in an early period. But this is just an unprecedented time. That's the only way I can think of communicating this. This has never been seen before, at least in modern human history, the machine age. So we've got to adapt to labor-saving technologies at some point.
Sure. For really old school conservative thinkers here, there's probably a lot of negative sides that are initially coming out, right? People not working, they're going to be lazy, they're doing things that we don't value. But, one really interesting point when researching this topic was a guy that, the guy writing the article basically said that we look at a 24-year-old who's sitting in his parents' house playing video games, doing something mindless. And we say, what are you doing? This is a useless activity. That's bad. You shouldn't be doing that. But if they're doing a mindless activity at work, say like checking people out. Not that that's not valuable, but I'm saying when they're doing something that's not challenging, that's not engaging, that they don't enjoy, it becomes a really positive thing. And I guess because they're providing some kind of service. But if we had all the machines doing the drudgery for us, it would really free human beings up to think in more creative, ingenious ways to really run after their passions, to give time to the things that they really think matters most. And again, for me, Shane, you made the point earlier. If you told me what's the number one priority that I have currently as I think about my career the next 30 years, if technology doesn't change, it's about maximizing time with my family. Because I think at the end of the day, that's going to be the most important thing to me. And that's really kind of one of the interesting things to think about, much more naturally than older generations, because we can imagine a world where we're not working 50 hours a week and taking an income and getting 2 weeks off a year and telling other people to go raise our kids. We're really actually imagining an economy in a world where we can spend as much time with our kids as people in the agrarian economies were able to do.
Yeah, it could be an interesting time. There are some other benefits to UBI outside of just what we've been saying, which is relating to how are we going to handle influx in technology. But there are other benefits that could come around today, Cade. Do you know of any of those?
So the benefits of what exactly do you mean? Sorry.
Of the UBI. So like I'll share one. I mean, I think we have a few that we wanted to share, like other benefits of the UBI. We've already said that it ought to improve welfare for the poor because subsidies just flat out aren't working right now. It's like an example outside of the United States, because we might look at the United States and say, well, it's all right. But we're also just one small percentage of the entire population. So if we think about over 1 billion people in India, where about 40% of all subsidies aren't actually reaching the poor. They're not actually reaching the citizens in which they are intended for. So the way the welfare system is set up, it's based off of subsidies versus a check. Essentially, it's not based off of a flat basic income. It is set up in terms of subsidies, and those subsidies aren't always reaching citizens. And it also goes back to the point that I was making earlier, which is that without cash, you don't have the freedom to spend the money the way that you want to spend it. So in India, people are not usually getting access to the best resources. They're getting access to these subsidized resources, which are generally like pretty shitty.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I actually think back to my undergrad, and I look at we had a school of Austrian economists in Auburn, Alabama, of all places, and Ludwig von Mises is one of the it's called the von Mises Institute, who was really well known as kind of a new thinker in economics, and his Austrian economics is kind of a way of thinking about economics that has become more popular. But he used to say things about socialism that weren't that positive, but I wonder what he'd say here, because there was always this rhyme that said, there once was a man named von Mises who looked at the socialist pieces of theory and said, we're better off dead. Life's better when freedom increases. And so to me, it's about that tension that we could walk in potentially with this universal basic income, where we free people up from drudgery like we talked about, but we're also giving freedom. We're not shackling people to particular places where they have to spend their money, or a standard of living that's just never going to allow for any kind of upward mobility. But one thing we probably also need to mention, Shane, is that this problem or this new advancement is so complex and it has so many variables. Who really knows what the effects are going to be, right? But the only thing that I'm certain about after researching this topic is that it's not going to be simple. Our system one type thinking, where we say work's good, people working isn't bad, thus UBI must be a bad thing. I don't think that really works in this case because we can't imagine a world where these kind of options are going to be the best for the most people.
Yeah, I mean, and what are we going to do when there's just a small percentage of individuals who are collecting the majority of the wealth, the majority of the resources? Whether it's a government handling its own natural resources, or whether it's a company like Google and Apple and Facebook and Amazon and the big four who are taking over the world. What happens when not everybody can work for those four major companies? So there is something here to the sense of justice as well. Like a good example would be oil money in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a few countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are fairly oil rich, but right now the way that the natural resources or the money earned from those natural resources are working is they're basically being funneled straight to the government, and then the government takes some of it and then some of it gets redistributed to the people, but it doesn't usually touch a lot of the citizenship. So what if there was a world in which like the state oil revenues were transferred directly to the citizenship, or the technology revenues generated from some new infrastructural technology that I can't even imagine at this moment because it hasn't even been created. Those revenues get transferred directly to the citizenship instead of just flowing up to the government and just going into the hands of maybe 1, 2, or 3 major companies that have the financial and computational power to create that technology. So that's the other good defense for a universal basic income, a world in which there's just no way of competing with the biggest dogs, the governments of the world, and the big 4 or 5 companies and the richest people.
I think that's a fantastic point. And this is furthermore why I see another positive result of this being that if the government is redistributing wealth in a universal basic income, most people think, oh, that sounds like a liberal plan where the government is taking more control. But actually, when you think about it, the government should shrink exponentially because there are less companies to regulate. There are less bureaus that have to make sure working conditions are okay. You don't have the IRS that's as expansive as they've been because you have simpler tax codes where people own, smaller levels of assets and everyone makes the same amount of money. You have less companies that you need to regulate. I mean, all of these things I think should lead to more freedom for people and therefore less government regulation. So it's really kind of counterintuitive in that way that it sounds liberal at first, but it seems fairly politically neutral. And that's why I like when economists are trying to be objective and not think about this politically, but let's think about it as the data drives us.
Right. We're thinking about a brand new problem that's never been tackled before. So trying to prescribe Republican principles or Democratic principles at this problem is probably futile. We probably need a totally new solution for a totally new problem.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more.
Cool. All right. Well, let's close this thing out. I will say that there's one pretty helpful thought process that's been going on in my mind after reading some of the resources that Cade and I checked through. And one was this analogy that likened the human being to the horse. For centuries, people have created technology to improve the horse. It happened for like 3 or 4 centuries. The horse was the primary means of transportation, the primary means of combat and creating war. So plows were created for farming, armor was created for battle. All of these technologies were surrounding the horse. And I bet if we went back to the Middle Ages when the horse was the primary means of technology, all of the entrepreneurs would be sitting around, Cade. They'd be having a podcast talking about advanced technologies, and those technologies would all be complementary to the horse, would they not? They'd all be thinking about the next cool thing that can be done with the horse. But then along came the internal combustion engine. Along came Henry Ford, who made it scalable, and all of a sudden, we had tractors for farming, and we had tanks for battle. And the horse became completely obsolete in just a matter of 2 or 3 decades. Who uses a horse for work today? I think literally no one. I don't even really know what value horses provide the world anymore because we don't need them either. So I'm asking this question. In 2030, what will companies be using to replace humans with? What will machines be able to do that humans have never been able to do? I think we better be ready for a solution. We better come up with something, whether it's a UBI, a universal basic income, or something else, but something that makes the most sense to prepare for when the human being becomes the next horse.
Hopefully people, after listening to the content, where I stand is that seems like there's some really, really good things that could come out of this and some really, really strange things that we haven't encountered before. But let's try to be semi-progressive in our thinking because we would just be really silly to not learn from history, right? And what you're drawing out is just kind of a foundational example. Things change. So what are we going to do when it happens?
Right. And if the second machine age, which is a great book, I've only read about half of it, scammed through it. But if you've checked it out, the second machine age basically says that computers are so dexterous that it's impossible to predict what they're going to do in the next 10 years. It's literally impossible for us to see into the future and understand the technologies that are going to come. So the best we can do is prepare for what is already starting to trend, a world in which the labor market has diminished. We no longer have labor jobs to do. And what are we going to spend our time with? How are we going to earn our income? What's going to happen?
Sure, no doubt about it. I'm informed, stimulated, and inspired right now.
All right, cool. Well, it's a tough topic. If anybody has any questions or comments, they can leave them in the YouTube section. We will get to those. But kid, I think that is all for now. So I will see you later.
Peace out.